So here in the election of 1968, the Republicans settle on a candidate early, picking Richard Nixon, who you may remember had been the Republican candidate 8 years earlier when he lost to John F. Kennedy in 1960. But now, Nixon was back. In fact, this was really a big political comeback because he had lost the presidency and then he ran for governor of California and lost again, and it looked like he was finished. And in fact, he told a plane full of reporters, he said, well, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. He was out. But then, by 1968, circumstances had changed, the country has changed a lot, and Nixon is back, baby. These were the days when Win with Dick bubblegum cigars were a good idea. So Nixon developed what Republicans would come to call a Southern strategy. The idea was to reach out to white Southerners who, remember, have been disappointed and even furious at the National Democratic Party for years now. But they haven't felt like they've had any place to go. Where are they going to go? The party of Lincoln? The party that created the 14th Amendment? The party that freed the slaves? The party that passed the Civil Rights Act? Is where they're at instead. The Democrats. So the Republican idea was to reach out to white Southerners and tell them that your new home could be in the Republican Party. To do it, Nixon relied on Southern leaders, like your old friend Strom Thurmond. Remember, not enough troops in the federal army? Yeah, Strom Thurmond, who campaigned for Nixon in the South. But Nixon had a problem. If Nixon was trying to appeal to white Southerners, there was a bigger appeal. George Wallace. Wallace was a candidate in the election of 1968, running as an independent, as a third-party candidate. And Wallace said it was time to let the people speak. Time to stand up for America. Which people? Which America? If you said white people, you got it. The idea was that black people and their white civil rights champions had taken the country into this path of riots and disorder. And Wallace brought crowds to ecstasy with lines like, "The next time some protester lies down in front of my automobile, it'll be the last automobile he lies down in front of, I'll tell you that." Wallace will run your ass over. That's where we're at. And crowds go nuts for it. Eat it up. You would think that Wallace would do well in the South. And that's exactly the way it appeared it was going to turn out. And that's sort of not surprising. You know, the segregationist governor of Alabama is likely to do well in the South. But here's the part that blew a lot of people's minds. In the summer and early fall of 1968, polls showed that in the three-way race with a Republican and a Democrat and G-Dub up here, G-Dub 2, with Wallace in the race, he might be able to win states like Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania. What has made so many people in places like Indiana and Ohio say, "Oh yeah, I think I'm going to vote for George Wallace in the fall. I'm going to vote for the greatest symbol of resistance to integration and equality. That's who I'm going to vote for." What is the one-word answer, the best one-word answer that's made people feel this way? It is the riots. If you were going to add a second word, it would be Panthers. It's turned people against civil rights in general. The Democrats still hadn't picked a candidate when they met for their convention in late August 1968. Thousands of anti-war protesters converged on the city of Chicago, where the Democrats were holding their convention. You see, the way these anti-war protesters saw it, it was a democratic war. It was democratic presidents who had gotten us into this. And so, a coalition of anti-war groups, most of them student groups, a sort of weird mix of thousands of hippies, student radicals, and Black Panthers, converged on the city of Chicago. And the mayor of Chicago had told the protesters not to come. He wanted to use the convention to show off Chicago, to promote tourism. He didn't want thousands of protesters. The protesters came anyway and took the position that public parks were public. And they could hang out and protest in a public park because it's public. But the mayor of Chicago sent the Chicago police to evict them from the park with force. And the police came in, shooting tear gas, swinging nightsticks. And these protesters are not some nonviolent group led by Dr. King. And damn it, they fought back. They picked up rocks and bottles and bricks. They smashed windows. And now imagine, you're an ordinary American, sort of, getting home from work, getting home from the plant, and you decide to sit down in front of the TV and see if the Democrats have picked a candidate there at their convention. So you turn on the TV, you sit down, and instead of seeing the images of political maneuvering from inside the convention, this is what you see. Chaos and violence in the streets of Chicago. And which party is already associated with war and riots and protests and disorder? The Democratic Party. In the last weeks of the campaign, Nixon saw his path to victory. It was to sound a little bit more like George Wallace, so that those people in Indiana and Ohio and places like that who were thinking about voting for Wallace vote for the sort of a little bit more responsible Richard Nixon instead. And in the last weeks of the campaign, Nixon talked incessantly about law and order. Law and order. When I'm President of the United States, we'll have law and order in this country. I promise you that. Law and order. And the law and order appealed to the same people who cheered wildly when Nixon said he would run your ass over. But it sounds a little more responsible, a little more presidential. And Nixon manages to win the election of 1968. The Democrats had picked a candidate, but I didn't even tell you his name, because I think we can get through here without him. Now I'm going to tell you. Hubert Humphrey. But Humphrey loses. Nixon wins, even though you see it's very, very close in the popular vote. It's not close in the electoral vote, because Nixon is able to limit Wallace's support to the Deep South. And who wins most of the rest of the South? Not the Democratic Party anymore, but the Republicans. White Southerners are beginning their switch to the Republican Party, as black people in the country are switching loyally to the Democratic Party. The great political switch of our course is reaching the point where it stands today. So you look at all the areas here that are either green or purple, and that's where Wallace got at least 11.5% of the vote. And you see, it's not just the South, right? It sort of stretches these green areas, and even the orange areas where he gets 7% or more. There's lots of it around the country. And all of this is backlash. Backlash against the riots and the disorder. And what did Nixon come to office promising? Law and order. So in one of his first moves as president, Nixon had 8 of the organizers of those Chicago protests arrested. They were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit a riot. Conspiracy to commit a riot. And they became known as the Chicago 8. The idea was that these 8 leaders had hatched a conspiracy to come to Chicago and be attacked by the police, and then fight back, which they really did do. The point of putting the leaders of these protests on trial, on a federal charge that could put them away for a decade, was to scare the hell out of everybody who went to a protest. Nixon was trying to deliver on law and order. Now, one of the 8 was Bobby Seale. And in the beginning phase of the trial, Bobby Seale insisted on being allowed to defend himself. And the judge refused to allow it. The judge didn't want Bobby Seale getting up in a courtroom every day and using it for his political views, which is exactly what Bobby Seale wanted to do. So the judge wouldn't allow it. Well, Bobby Seale sort of refused to allow the trial to go on by continuing to interrupt. He was held in contempt of court, and he keeps interrupting. And then, the judge ordered the co-founder of the Black Panthers bound and gagged inside the courtroom. They tied him to a chair and put a gag in his mouth. And he still refused to be silent, shouting through the gag. And the judge ruled that Bobby Seale would be tried separately. And the Chicago 8 became the Chicago 8-1, or as people now call them, the Chicago 7, because they did the math. And here is the other members of the Chicago 8 with Bobby Seale's wife and child, and their kidnapped poster of Bobby Seale, who's been kidnapped by the federal government. The trial of the other 7 went on as the Chicago 7. And these guys understood that the government was trying to make an example of them, to stifle the spirit of protest across the country. And so they tried to make a mockery of the courtroom. They interrupted again and again, liar, hypocrite, fascist pig, contempt of court. They introduced songs as evidence, protest, peace songs. One day they came in and waved a North Vietnamese flag in the courtroom. They put their feet up on the defense table. One of them brought a container of weed to the courtroom one day. One day, 2 of them came in wearing judges' robes, and the judge came in and they refused to stand up, and the judge, all furious, banging his gavel, orders them to take those robes off, and finally they both stand up, take the judge's robes off, and underneath they're wearing police outfits. Now, at the end of all this, they were actually found not guilty on the major charge, the conspiracy to commit a riot, because a few of the jurors recognized it as a trumped-up false charge and refused to go along with the rest of the jurors. But despite that, all the Chicago 7 went away to prison. For what? Contempt contempt of court. There were almost 160 contempt of court violations given by the judge. He actually sent their lawyer away to prison too for contempt of court. So this Chicago 8 trial is one of the outcomes of the election of 1968. Nixon delivering on law and order. But it was just the beginning. Around the country, in the first year of Nixon's presidency, more than 100 Black Panthers were killed by law enforcement authorities. More than 1,000 Black Panthers went away to prisons on whatever kind of charges people could find. And the Panthers became more and more radical in response, more devoted to revolution, as did SNCC. SNCC, which had started 9 years ago as a nonviolent student group, was now a revolutionary group. And H. Rap Brown, who had replaced Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown made Stokely Carmichael sound like a timid moderate. He liked to tell frightened crowds things like, black people built America, and if America don't come around, black people are going to burn America down. And violence is as American as apple pie. H. Rap Brown said, I got one more H. Rap Brown for you. I got lots of H. Rap Brown, but one more for you. He says in one speech at a big rally, he says, you see, there is no in-between. You're either free or you're a slave. There's no such thing as second-class citizenship. That's like telling me you can be a little bit pregnant. So if you're denied your rights at all, you go in the category of slave. That's the way we need to see it. In other speeches, he urged serious revolutionaries to start taking down the pigs. That people should shoot police officers. Stokely Carmichael had left SNCC for the Panthers, but then left the Panthers because he was disappointed that they were so willing to work with white people. And completely devoted to black nationalism, he helped form a new group called United Slaves, whose initials were U.S. We are the U.S. And now, the United Slaves and SNCC and the Panthers fought with each other. They badmouthed each other in public and in their printed writings. They sometimes fought with each other. And every once in a while, shot at each other. It was as though the whole movement was imploding. Why? Why? Why?